Thank you, everyone, for being here. You've braved the biblical storms. I'd like to say that I had nothing to do with it, but we will, in my presentation today, be touching on some themes adjacent to Sodom and Gomorrah, so I'm not going to be totally innocent on this front. And I feel that I should also, by way of a content warning, just mention that on some of my slides there will be words and language that are used that have historically and are still used contemporarily as terms of abuse, homophobic, transphobic, whorephobic, and misogynistic slurs. But the only reason that I use that language is within the context of whether those communities can reclaim such language as we're thinking about the role of identity and post-identity in the digital era. It's also an absolute privilege to be doing my very first book launch at Oxford University, one of the oldest universities in the world. But of course, there are many things that are older than books and universities still. And so something that I'd like to ruminate in this talk today is a well-known idiom or euphemism for prostitution or sex work, which is the oldest profession. And as it is a disputed term, and not least because when we think about modern professions, they don't typically align with some of those ideas around what it means to be a worker, or to be a professional, or to be a labourer, or to apply a stable and fixed identity to such aspects of our identity. As you can see from the title of the book, Not Sex Work, this is based on my PhD research, which was with young gay, bi, and queer men who sold sex online, but neither advertised nor identified as sex workers or indeed workers. So what I'd like to do today is to explore some of those themes that come out in the book. Each chapter of the book begins with a quote from one of the participants who I interviewed for this study. And I think what that helps to demonstrate is how this research was very much co-created by those young men who I interviewed, and how they shaped my thinking, particularly towards a more post-identity, post-Marxist perhaps, and certainly postmodern framework. That's not how I started out as a PhD researcher, but it's certainly where I ended up, and that was largely led by the empirical research. For example, the first quote I use in chapter 1 from Alex is this one. And it's worth noting that the original study had a different title. It was Incidental Sex Work, and even at one point, The Incidental Sex Worker. But I realized that I was potentially imposing an identity label on those participants, which was one they didn't necessarily see representing them. As Alex said, incidental sex worker is a term you could use, but as I don't see this as a regular part of my life, I don't see any need to give it a name. Just like you wouldn't really give a name to somebody who did people's hair every now and again, you wouldn't call yourself an incidental hairdresser. It's just a thing that you do. So this also highlights two of the main reasons that the participants gave for not identifying as sex workers. Firstly, because their behaviours were not regular enough to be considered as a form of labour. For example, 19 of the 50 participants were only paid for sex once, others just 2 times, 3 times, or a small handful of times. So for them, the irregularity of their being paid for sex meant it couldn't be considered as a form of work like any other. The second main reason was because they didn't view themselves as doing anything that was professional enough to count as work. But there were also more complicated reasons that the participants gave for distancing themselves from these labels and from these identities. For example, referring to this idiom, Nate said, even though it's called the oldest profession, there's a massive stigma attached to it in society. So I think knowing that people would judge makes you judge yourself to a certain extent. People either tend to err on the side of sympathy to the point of condescension, where it's like, you must have had daddy issues, or the other way they'll go is to just see you as the scum of the earth, basically. Now, the reason that I've highlighted this second quote is because I think it was really interesting that here Nate is obviously talking about sex work stigma and wanting to avoid being associated with the stigma attached to sex workers. So in many ways, something that came through in the interviews were that the participants were potentially seeking to avoid the double deviance or the sexual stigma of being both young gay, bi, and queer men who had also sold sex. But also, there's something about this phrase, daddy issues, that speaks to, he's talking about sex work stigma, but it also speaks to a well-trodden trope around homophobia, the idea that people are queer because they have some kind of familial issues, lack of strong father figure, all of those tried and tested and largely disproven myths around homosexuality. So it's the first clue, I think, that there's something going on between these two identities, an overlapping history and an intersecting politics, as I suggest in the blurb. Other reasons that participants may have avoided these labels are because of the stereotypes surrounding sex work. We're all familiar with many of these tropes. We see them in our newspapers whenever there's a story or a headline about commercial sex, whether it's on the criminalization of commercial sex or other changes to the sex industry that have been taking place over recent years. I'm sure that you can all imagine them: the short skirts, the dark makeup, the other symbolic markers that represent sex work, and usually associated with women. So these participants, being young men, perhaps didn't see themselves reflected by that label for a range of complicated reasons. Now, to start thinking about theory, and sticking with daddy issues, shall we turn to our collective daddies? In other words, one of the so-called founding fathers of sociology, Karl Marx. So, given that the title of the book is not sex work, I thought it was important to define terms. And Marx gives us a helpfully broad definition of labour power as the aggregate of those mental and physical capabilities existing in the physical form, the living personality of a human being, which produce a use value of any kind. Marxist understandings of labour, and perhaps especially Marxist feminist understandings of labour, have underpinned the dominant research paradigm within sex work research, namely the social and economic model. So sex work researchers have explored all kinds of aspects of how sex work can be compared to other forms of work, concepts like emotional labour, therapeutic labour, caring labour. So this, in many ways, is something that the book begins to critically engage with by looking at the experiences of people who did something that they didn't necessarily consider work, even though it might align with some of these more familiar concepts within sex work research. Alongside defining work, of course, we need to define sex. So to give us some more daddy issues, here, of course, is Sigmund Freud. And at the turn of the century, the early sexologists and psychoanalysts, including Freud, began to develop a more secular, scientific approach to understanding sex, gender, and sexuality. It was also perhaps more sympathetic than the pre-modern and religious ideas around sexual morality that preceded it, although was still problematic in a number of ways. Another thing that sex work researchers have highlighted is that male sex workers in particular came to the attention of the sexologists and psychoanalysts. For example, in his 3 theories on the theory of sexuality, Freud asked, how would it be possible to explain the fact that male prostitutes who offer themselves to inverts, we would use the term homosexuals today, again, showing how identity, language, and labels shift over time, today, just as they did in ancient times, imitate women in all the externals of their clothing and behavior. So again, returning to that issue of gendered stereotypes as being a key dimension of how we understand sex work, another reason that the participants gave for not identifying with these labels were that they didn't want to be associated with those stereotypes. As Freddie said, you think of people working on the street corner, the red light district. You think of webcam shows, Rentboy websites, stuff like that. You don't think of a 19-year-old boy on Grindr meeting 2 random people for £20 and £50. That wouldn't be the first port of call if you ever said, think of a sex worker. Now, I think it's important to note that alongside seeking to distance themselves from the stigmas and stereotypes associated with sex work as gendered labour, or indeed as a form of labour at all, many of the participants were also allies of sex workers and had friends who were either professional or non-professional or more amateur sex workers, even if they distanced themselves from these labels. For example, Will talked about his experiences of talking to other people with similar experiences, as well as some of the different labels that might have been applied to him that he didn't necessarily felt reflected what he had done. For example, he said, the people I know who have done it they identify as having done sex work, but not as being a sex worker. Like, I was talking to someone and he referred to me as being an escort, but I never thought of it as being a part of myself, because I guess it's just something I'm doing for now. Now, Will was one of the very few participants who toyed with the possibility of considering himself a part-time sex worker, but ultimately he decided that the label wasn't something that he had earned, like many of his more professional sex working friends. So we have a combination of overlapping and complex reasons that these participants sought to distance themselves from those labels, including the irregularity of their behaviours, the non-professionalism of what they were doing, the avoidance of stigmas and stereotypes, but also at times a sense of solidarity with another marginalised sexual minority group. Now, it's important to also note the long history of feminist resistance to these processes of othering. For example, in The Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir questioned what differentiated marriage from prostitution, not least because both could be interpreted through the lens of an exchange of economic resources for sex. As she wrote, from the economic point of view, the sex worker's situation is symmetrical to the married woman's. The main difference between them is that the legitimate woman, oppressed as a married woman, is respected as a human person. This respect begins seriously to bring a halt to oppression. Another key theorist in my thinking is, of course, Michel Foucault and the history of sexuality. And in one of the most famous quotes from this book, Foucault wrote that the sodomite had been a temporary aberration, the homosexual was now a species. Here he was drawing attention to how pre-modern religious notions of sodomy as habitual sin had been replaced by modern secular ways of thinking about sexuality as a more fixed and stable identity category, often from birth to death. We still see this narrative in, for example, the Born This Way movement as a part of the LGBTQ plus rights and liberation movement. I also sometimes, when teaching this to students, look around the room and embarrass them all by saying, look, I can't possibly know anything about your intimate lives, but when we think about terms like sodomy or sodomite, as I hinted to at the beginning, in our modern secular world, it's difficult to imagine that most, many, maybe all people in this room could be classified as sodomites. Now, that's because we often associate it with homosexuality, but of course, in religious traditional understandings of that term, it refers to any form of sex that is non-procreative, in other words, not leading to babies. So that would include masturbation, oral sex, a whole range of sexual practices that would have been forbidden under such religious law and prohibition. However, as we shifted into more modern ways of understanding sexuality as an identity, Foucault also noted that homosexuality began to speak in its own behalf, to demand that its legitimacy or naturality be acknowledged, often in the very same vocabulary. And I think the key framework that Foucault gives to us is this idea of discourses of sexuality changing over time and through history, but also in this idea of minority groups speaking for themselves, the notion of reverse discourses, people taking on board those forms of labeling and ways of speaking and either subverting them or co-opting them. And we have seen this occurring throughout the 20th century in relation to both LGBTQ plus people and to sex workers. So, for example, in the 1957 Wolfenden Report on Homosexual Offences and Prostitution, which itself, interestingly, constructs homosexuality as an offence, and a comparable offence, perhaps, to commercial sex, we saw the recommendation which eventually led, 10 years later, in 1967, to the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality, but not prostitution. Now, most people suggest that this was because of the liberalism that underpinned Wolfenden's report, that it viewed homosexuality as something in private, away from public view, whereas prostitution was public and therefore could offend and cause injury. And that was why one was partially decriminalised, but the other not. However, we could also look at it through a gendered lens. If homosexuality was viewed as men's sexual obedience and prostitution as women's, then we see this discrepancy in the way that both are understood. One of my suggestions in the book is that in the digital era, this division between public and private has become increasingly blurred. The digital platforms on which my participants were selling sex, it's not always clear whether those were public or private exchanges. And this may be one reason why governments around the world are struggling to legislate in efforts to, often unsuccessful efforts, to control digital spaces and platforms and forms of sexuality on them. Just a couple of years later, in 1969, we see the Stonewall riots in New York City, and the gay liberation movement is brought to a global stage. So the 1970s could be understood as a period of liberation where LGBTQ people are reversing that discourse of criminalization and stigmatization and demanding greater rights, respect, and recognition. At the same time, the word or the term sex work or sex worker is invented by Carol Lee after she attends a feminist conference in San Francisco. She resisted or opposed the title of that conference, which was the sex use industry, and suggested that it be changed to the sex work industry to recognize her role as an agent and actor in the transaction. Again, you can see similar patterns of reverse discourse in constructing identity. Again, in the 1980s, both groups are affected disproportionately by the global epidemic of HIV and AIDS, and both groups experience an increase in stigma and an increase in criminalization and marginalization. But at the same time, we see other resistance movements, for example, ACT UP, as represented by the famous Keith Haring poster here. Then from the 1990s onwards, my suggestion is that we have entered into the digital era, where these forms of identity politics, which we saw in the 60s, 70s, 80s, maybe have begun to wane. To paraphrase Jeffrey Weeks, in the millions of possible interactions in cyberspace, the distinctions between men and women, heterosexual and homosexual, young and old, and many other categories may dissolve easily. Yet, at the same time, on platforms such as Grindr, where I did my research, we see an increasing number of identity categories that can be used both earnestly and playfully by those who log on. Many sociologists have noted that an increasing number of young people identify as LGBTQ+, but there are also new and expanding options for people to use. Someone could be asexual, bisexual, pansexual, gay. We even have more and more research with men who have sex with men but who identify as straight, and they might use a term such as down low on these platforms and generally. Again, returning to that quote about the distinction between it being something one is or something one does, when we look at sexual roles like being a bottom, a top, a verse, or a side, a newer term which refers to people who don't engage in penetrative sex at all, these can both be identities or they can be behaviors. So again, we're looking here at the duality of sexuality through both lenses. If we turn to the BDSM or kink community, someone could be a dominant, a submissive, a switch, or belong to subcultural communities within, such as engaging in practices like pig play or pup play. These labels are also, of course, classed, gendered, racialized, as well as obviously sexualized. And so we might think about terms like masc, femme, fluid, and so on. And indeed, on apps like Grindr, you can choose from a selection of so-called gay tribes. Someone could identify as a bear, a daddy, an otter, a jock, a scally, a twink, and so on. Twink was the most popular option for the participants in this study. As I mentioned at the beginning, we also see some arguing that we can reclaim slurs and terms of abuse. For example, the D word, the F word, the T word, and indeed the origins of queer activism and queer theory begin in this same kind of discussion. Is queer a slur, or can we reclaim it and use it affirmatively? And that's one of the reasons why I've been drawn to queer theory and research in this project. It also draws on postmodern feminist debates and discussions around whether misogynistic terms can be reclaimed. I'm thinking here of the bitch manifesto, the slut manifesto. And of course, this is all relevant to our consideration of whether identity labels around sex work, like escort, rent boy, prostitute, whore, and so on, can be reclaimed or discarded altogether. Now, one of the things I find interesting about thinking about all of these expanding sets of possible sexual identities and behaviors is that there's something almost zoological about it. Indeed, one could be a pig or a pup or a bear or an otter, and many others. We haven't even got into furries. So this is a limited list of potential options. So something interesting and complicated is going on here. Is the digital era really leading to a dissolution of identity or an expansion of it? Or maybe some of these are being used ironic, playfully, not being adopted as a core feature of personal identity and personhood, but instead something that is used on these platforms to convey something. And of course, we shouldn't lose sight also of the role of gay pornography in reifying many of these identities, or these behaviors rather, as identities. That brings me on to another influential theorist in my thinking, Gail Rubin. And Rubin's model of the charmed circle and outer limits of sexual respectability. According to this model, Rubin suggested that any sex that is confined to the outer limits of acceptability or respectability is defined by our culture as bad, abnormal, or unnatural, whereas those within the charmed circle are afforded the status of good, normal, and natural. And she sought to challenge this with a more culturally relativist anthropological approach to understanding sexualities. The reason I think this model is so useful for my study is because the participants engaged in virtually every set of behaviors in the outer limits. The sex they were having was unmarried, it was promiscuous, it was non-procreative, it was for money. Sometimes it was alone or in groups, it was casual, it was cross-generational in that the men who were paying them for sex were usually significantly older. It was often in public places, and for a handful of participants, it involved the production of pornography through webcamming, and later on through OnlyFans. It also often involved forms of kink or BDSM practice. So perhaps in the digital era, these binary distinctions between good sex, bad sex, and how one identifies have begun to blur. For example, thinking not just about sexuality, but also gender, Ricky said, I don't agree with the whole opposite sex, same sex thing, really. For a start, I don't think men are the opposite of women in any sense. I'm read as male in most circumstances. Obviously, these casual dating apps are a good example of that. But I'm gender non-conforming and think of myself as kind of equally bad at being masculine and bad at being feminine. I can relate. Relatedly, Tommy said, since the last time we chatted, there's been a lot of discourse, not only about sex work, but also about gender and specifically non-binary identities. So again, we might want to think about this post-identity digital era as connecting with lots of different trends and themes that we're seeing as sociologists of gender and sexuality. So you might be wondering, Max, how on earth did you find so many people to interview about their experiences, given that they neither advertised nor identified as anything to do with sex work? So another queer theorist who's greatly influenced my work is Jack Halberstam, who defined a queer methodology as a scavenger methodology that uses different methods to collect and produce information on subjects who have been deliberately or accidentally excluded from traditional studies of human behavior. In other words, those who don't fit within the dominant research paradigm of the social and economic model. But in order to find them, I had to get quite creative and use a diverse range of methods. So I won't talk about all of these. As is already clear, what I'm focusing on today are that the main form of data collection were semi-structured qualitative interviews. However, these included some creative approaches, such as photo elicitation procedures. I asked the participants to show me their profiles, talk through how they represented themselves visually on those platforms to see where their subtle cues going on. How did they see themselves as gay, bi, and queer men representing themselves online? I also used a 9-point sexuality scale, an expanded version of the Kinsey scale, which also asked questions not only about how they saw themselves now, but how they might see themselves in the future, how they position themselves not just in terms of sexual attraction, but also romantic attraction. But actually, this was one of the reasons why Ricky challenged my methods here, because he suggested that it was nonetheless still too binary, rooted in an idea of attraction to male or female. So as you can see, I was challenged theoretically and methodologically by my participants, and that's partly why I shifted my own thinking over time. So to go into a bit more detail, oh yes, also I should note that I ended up doing a kind of accidental or incidental mixed method study, because in order to find these participants, I ended up doing a kind of informal survey of Grindr users. And the way that this happened was that I travelled to major cities across England and Wales with a presumption that in densely populated urban areas, these types of interactions would be more likely to take place. So I went to London, Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, Southampton, Newcastle, Bristol, and Cardiff. And I sent out 3,000 recruitment messages to nearby profiles that were under the age of 30. Again, making a presumption that it would be young men who might be more likely to have received such offers. And I asked them a very simple question. Have you ever been offered money for sex? And said, yes. And in response to this, you can see I had a nearly 50% response rate to my original question. Most of the responses I got to this were offended at the question. Do I look like a sex worker? Many thought that I was propositioning them. Many thought that I was seeking them to proposition me. And this all hinted at this being a much more common practice than perhaps has been previously considered, as well as supporting those earlier themes we touched on around sex work stigma and stereotypes. Of those 215 who initially responded saying yes, 2.3% said that they had engaged in more professional forms of sex work, like escorting or pornography production, but a much higher number, 8.2%, had engaged in more amateur forms of sex work, like incidental sex work, as I defined it, or webcamming. Now, this suggests that perhaps there are forms of sex work taking place much more commonly and in many more locations than we had considered before. And this might diversify our understanding of sex work in the digital era. The only other thing I wanted to briefly note is another text by Halberstam that I'm inspired by is the book The Queer Art and Failure. And my initial approach to participant recruitment is represented here by the image of a sign that I made. I tried to get creative with it out of colourful bits of cardboard, plastic, even some banknotes, asking that question. And I created a very kind of professional research profile on Grindr using the title Research with a little synopsis of what the study was all about. I'm holding up this sign. Absolutely nobody responded. So it was a failed method, a failed approach to recruitment. So instead, I adopted a more informal approach, just used a photo of myself sitting in a cafe, the kind of environment where the interviews took place. And then, as I say, in response to that, lots more people messaged me. And to give you a bit of a sense for how these interactions went between the participants and the men who offered them and paid them for sex, some participants sent me screenshots of the chats they've been having. And this is my very amateur MS Paint mock-up of one of those conversations. And you can see how digital platforms like Grindr allowed people to negotiate over cost, price, amount of money, to negotiate what activities they'd be engaging in, what forms of sex, but also to very conveniently do things like share location or share photos. As Dean said, he messaged me first, straight away, saying, do you want to have sex? I think I may have asked for pictures because he didn't have them on his profile, so he sent me a few, and then I said, yeah. So while these experiences may have differed from much of the online sex work research literature, there were commonalities. So many online sex work researchers have suggested that the internet has improved the safety, satisfaction, and convenience of selling sex, not least because workers, or in this case, not workers, can vet the people who they're meeting through photos. They can take screenshots of the conversations. They can let someone know where they're going. Or indeed, if you're thinking about forms of online sex work like webcamming, there is no physical interaction whatsoever. So physical safety has almost certainly been improved. That's not to say that everything is rosy in the digital era. Of course, we see an increase in things like cyber stalking, cyber harassment, hate speech online, and so on and so forth. So it's a complicated picture, but certainly this points to a broader shift within the literature and the research. Also in chapter 5, I do something which I've not seen in many other places apart from the animated series South Park, which is emoji analysis. And some research has suggested that increased use of emojis in direct message exchanges leads to people having more sex with each other. So again, I thought this might be an interesting thing to explore visually and discuss with the participants as a part of that photo elicitation. These were the most commonly used emojis on their profiles. And again, linking back to this notion of identity and behavior, the upward arrow and the downward arrow are used to refer to sexual role, whether one is a top or a bottom. So again, different ways of communicating identity that are not so direct and clear-cut. Oh, I did also miss over this in the methods, because I said 55 semi-structured interviews. That's because I did a very small handful of longitudinal interviews with participants who had stayed in touch with me. And the reason for this was because at the time of the original study, OnlyFans had only really just started. Not that many people knew about it. However, participants who had stayed in touch, I knew that some of them had gone on to have quite a lot of success on this platform. So I got back in touch with them to see whether new technologies, new digital platforms would change, whether they felt, how they felt about themselves, were they now more professional, or did they still resist those labels or distance themselves from those labels? And in general, to think about the role of shifting technology, how rapidly new apps, new platforms are changing how sex work takes place. And so to give you one example of this, Trevor said, I have quite a big Tumblr following, then they banned porn. And I was like, oh no, because I liked the attention. I was just posting on Twitter loads, and that's when I saw OnlyFans just creeping in. It was slowly getting bigger and bigger. That's when I started doing OnlyFans properly. I was making 2 to 3 grand each month, although it's very much based on who's following you. Now think back to the quote from Freddie, where he was making, what, £50, £20, by comparison to a substantial amount of money through sharing videos online. Nonetheless, Trevor still distanced himself from the label of sex worker. And the main reason for this was because the videos he was making and sharing online were with his boyfriend. In other words, they were videos he would have been making anyway, and the money remained incidental. The last quote I will share with you from the final chapter is from Tim, who said that it occurred as a part of my experimental phase when I was a student. I tried various things before and thought, I wonder if getting paid for sex feels any different. It wasn't an offensive experience, but once I performed the experiment, I didn't feel the need to do it again. As with most of my kinks, once I've tried it once, the novelty factor is gone, and I lose interest. So the way in which the participants described their experiences often overlapped with other aspects of their sexuality. They compared it, for example, to engaging in hookup culture and engaging in casual sex more generally, or indeed to sex work as being something that they experimented with as a form of play or as a kink in its own right. There are many, many contemporary sex work researchers who have influenced the project, and I can't name them all, as we're running out of time. But one who's been particularly influential is Angela Jones and her recent book, Cammy. And here Jones writes that the rise of online sex work presents new opportunities for studying and theorizing about sexuality, gender, race, inequality, and labor. And later on also notes, returning oldest forms of labor in the gig economy. So something that I seek to begin exploring in the conclusion is how we can think about the social and economic model in more complicated ways in the digital era. And so, for example, when we look at the wider literature on the gig economy, many have suggested that gig work can be thought of in the same way you might think of doing a gig at a music venue. But even there, someone who does a gig once or twice might frame that more as a hobby or a leisure activity rather than as an organized form of economic activity. This also links, of course, with the platform economy where being central to understanding of the gig economy or the app economy. And again, it's on these same platforms where we're seeing shifts not only in sexuality, but also in the labor market and in working practices. What I suggest in the conclusion, however, is that maybe we need a different framework altogether. So I suggest that we could discuss the play economy, or perhaps move beyond economic frameworks altogether and think about the play society. As suggested by that final quote from a participant, if they were thinking about being paid for sex through the language of hooking up, playing, experimenting, toying with, then maybe this could offer a useful way to rethink these forms of not sex work in the digital era. Give you one example. One of the messages that a participant received on Grindr from an older man propositioning him was very simple, and it was simply cash for fun. So fun, of course, being another euphemism for sex, and is a frequently used form of language on these dating and hookup apps. So several participants talked about experimenting with sex work as a kink, something that they did in order to enhance the experience. Did the exchange of money, did the power differentials, did the age differentials add something distinctive to the encounter? And maybe that challenges some of our more traditional ideas around exploitation and coercion. But at the same time, there were also persistent inequalities of power, pleasure, and pay, particularly along the lines of class, race, and gender. So we shouldn't lose sight of those as being a continuing problem, even within these encounters, which are framed very much in more casual and carefree terminologies. And finally, the question I'd like to end on and hear your thoughts on are, what about those rights-based movements? In other words, how can we have an LGBTQ plus rights movement without a clear definition of what the constituent parts of that mean? How can we have a sex workers' rights movement without a clear definition of who a sex worker is? And indeed, how can we have a workers' rights movement without some kind of identity underpinning those movements? So there are tensions at play here, and I haven't worked them all out, and I'm hoping that we in the Q&A can talk them through, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it as well. Thank you very much for listening.